In this video I'm going to try to show you how I mark an essay and what goes through the examiner's head. So the title here is Explore the Ways in which Priestley makes this such a dramatic and significant moment in the play. Okay, so we start brilliantly here. Priestley makes this a significant and dramatic moment. So I've ticked these because she's using the right language from the question to anchor her answer and tell the examiner, look, I'm actually answering the question. And she's come up with a method through his use of characters in the scene. And that's a solid start. However, she's going to get higher grades if she doesn't just concentrate on the characters, but she concentrates on something like the pace or the stage directions or the events. Okay, so you want to think about the play in performance, which is what this will give you, not just on the page, which is what the characters will give you. Sheila has a very significant role in the play as Burling's daughter. Excellent use of significant again. Anything in pink I've highlighted because there's a mistake, and spelling, punctuation and grammar aren't really penalised in most literature exams, but they do affect how the examiner thinks about you. So here this apostrophe is wrong, there's no letter missing here, and it's not an owner. Here in Burling's, Burling owns the daughter in the sentence, so that requires an apostrophe. She is shown through Priestley's incorrect spelling of the playwright's name, language to be a particularly, so there's a spelling mistake, untrustworthy character. Warningly, Sheila is part of line 5. Now that's not necessary in an exam because we don't need to find it. So just the quotation on its own is enough. Where Mrs. Burling implies, correct use of implies instead of infers, well done, she thinks that Sheila could betray her. This therefore is dramatic and significant, again using the words from the question, to the scene, as we wouldn't normally think a daughter would betray her mother. Well, that's good, but we can take a step further. Why does Priestley want the younger generation to potentially betray their parents? And this has all got to do about the handing over of power. So once the Burlings age, they're going to hand over their business, their wealth, their power to their children. And if Sheila rebels against her parents, there is an opportunity for the future to be improved because she will care about the working classes, just as Eric will. Now, the fact that by 1945 nothing has changed suggests that Sheila and Eric might have learnt the lesson but never achieved that power. So their parents kept the power to themselves, or it might be that they become, as they age, like their parents. Because now, at the moment in the play, it's 1912, but the play is written in 1945. And Priestley is trying to ask himself, why is it that the Sheilas and Erics haven't changed the world from this point to this point? Why are we still going through the Second World War? Why are the ruling classes still exploiting the working classes? And this is a vital thing. Once you start thinking about Priestley's purpose and how he's trying to change the points of view of the audience, that's when you get into the really high grades. Okay, let's carry on. Dramatic division also plays a significant part in this scene. Again, you don't need to say which lines it's in. Bitterly, I suppose we're all nice people now. Sheila says this in a sarcastic manner. Wrong spelling, that's the manor house. As she doesn't actually think that they are good people. This is really important. I'm going to ask you to remember this because this writer then contradicts that later on, and you really don't want to contradict yourself. This division occurs between Eric, Sheila and Burling. If you've nothing more sensible than that to say, Sheila, you'd better keep quiet. Burling here very adamantly disagrees with Sheila, as she says, and you always have a comma introducing quotation, we're all good people now. Now, you don't need to do this. You've already used that quotation earlier, so you could significantly reduce your words here, because he knows exactly who's to blame. Brilliant, you've made an excellent point here. But then who is to blame? And you've got to spell that out to us. So who is it? And why does Burling want to blame that person? presumably he's blaming Eric, and that means he doesn't have to take responsibility for the actions that he's taken with Eva, and that also lets everyone else in the family off the hook as well. So Burling is trying to pass the blame onto his children, and probably not his wife, because he'll agree with her that she did nothing wrong. This part of the scene is also very significant. Again, referring back to the language in the question is excellent. Eric, who Priestley decides to team up with Sheila, agrees with her point. She's right, though. By saying this, and when we start, there's a new sentence, so that's going to be a capital, we can infer that they both share the same opinion, and I've ticked infer because it's the correct use of infer to means to work out, so it implies, that they both share the same opinion of the way they should all feel now. Consequently, this makes Burling very angry as both his children have gone against him. Good. Priestley uses this argument as a great chance to include a fact about Eric. So I got excited here because I thought the candidate was going to talk about Priestley's purpose, and that's what I referred to earlier. Do you remember over here when I talked about how he's trying to change the views of the audience? And that's where she needs to come back to here, because this explains, doesn't it, why he hasn't let the younger generation acquire power. He doesn't trust them. Anyway, as a great chance to include a fact about Eric confessing, making this scene incredibly significant. Angrily, and you'd better keep quiet anyhow. If that had been a proper police inspector, he'd have heard, and it's not of, it's have, he'd have heard you confess. Priestley does this to cause a dramatic stir if the characters weren't already aware of Eric's confession. Well, here you need to be much more specific because they all know about this except one character in particular, and that character is Gerald. And now here you could explore why he doesn't want Gerald to know, because it's going to lead to it being less likely that Gerald will want to marry Sheila, marry into this family. Or you could say he wants to reveal it to Gerald now because he can tell that Gerald is actually on his side. Gerald is quite happy to cover up whatever wrongdoing they've done, and therefore will cover up Eric's stealing quite happily. This again suggests that perhaps that's just the way the ruling classes operate. They're quite used to stealing money. Perhaps that's how they got rich in the first place, exploiting the poor. Priestley makes such a dramatic scene by also linking some moments to the ending when Eva Smith dies. Linking your passage to the ending is always a really good technique and will always get you marks. So let's see how she does it. An example of this is when Mrs. Burling notices how Inspector Gould speaks to her and her husband, for instance. The rude way he spoke to Mr. Burling and me, it was quite extraordinary. This links us to the end of the play, as we know the real reason he was being rude was because he already knew that Eva was going through a hard time and that she'd previously had encounters with all the Burlings. That's very good. It's a strong interpretation. But again, we want to say why. So presumably, we need to tie this in with how the Burlings are the ruling classes exploiting the working classes. So Eva becomes a symbol for how they exploit the working class. And this candidate needs to be explicit about that. Okay. Also, Priestley makes Gerald a very dramatic and concerned character, as in one of Gerald's pieces of speech, Priestley uses the word dead. This is something that students often do. They say the writer has said something, but actually it's not. It's Gerald who's used the word dead, and she knows this, as we'll find out later. By saying that, makes use of the opinion, I think that should be, that Gerald doesn't actually feel guilty, so is desperate to make himself feel this way. That's a really sophisticated point. He's used the word dead in his speech to make himself feel more guilty for the death of Eva, because he's not actually feeling guilty. Now I think actually you need a little longer quotation here so we can see what he's describing as dead, because he's not talking about Eva at all, and it's the fact that he's using that word dead to describe something else that makes this such a sophisticated point. This is his conscience leaking out, if you like, into his language. Right. He also becomes dramatic before Gerald comes and tells everybody that the police officer is a fake. As well as this becomes, so it's a bit clumsy here, it becomes dramatic before Gerald comes and tells, well, I don't really understand that. It's actually the moment that we find out he's a fake that's dramatic. Let's carry on. Yes, and that's what would create a climax. As we, as the audience, could presume that Burling is going to cause an argument. This is because Eric confessed to something, to somebody who pretended to be an inspector. Okay, so I can see where we're going here. So he's revealed something to a member of the general public. Okay, but why is that dramatic? We need to link that to Burling's desire for a knighthood, and the need to avoid scandal that he referred to in the opening scenes with Gerald. So you've got to be specific. Gerald and the Burlings reject the inspector's teaching. Good. So this is talking about Priestley's purpose, and it's starting to get higher marks if we can pull it off. We are all of one body and responsible for each other. And using quotations from elsewhere is always a brilliant way of showing that you've got a complete understanding of the play. Burling tries to take responsibility, and now we get into a bit of trouble here because he doesn't. This makes a difference, you know. In fact, it makes all the difference. Now that sounds, if you read it on its own, as though he wants to take responsibility, but what's actually happening there is that it makes all the difference that the inspectors are fake, because that means they don't have to worry about what they've done to this girl Eva Smith. Burling could have been shown to take the inspector's advice through saying this, as he is actually taking responsibility. So we've got a problem because that's a misunderstanding of the play, and you'll see when you read the end how he ridicules Eric and Sheila for listening to the inspector. So this can't actually be a correct interpretation, I'm afraid. Sheila, however, has different ideas, as she doesn't think that any of them are to blame. I suppose we're all good people now. Do you remember she noticed that earlier and said it was sarcastic because, if we go back, here she doesn't actually think that they are good people, and that was a correct interpretation. But in writing the essay, she's forgotten that's why Sheila was being sarcastic. So Sheila here carries the inspector's message and therefore carries Priestley's message that actually the ruling class are not good people and that they are deceiving themselves. And that again is Priestley's purpose. That's where the marks are going to be. But she's incorrectly interpreted the end of this extract and the end of the play. She doesn't actually know if she should feel guilty or not. Well, clearly she does. There are lots of things she says in the play that show she does feel guilty. This is another prime example of how Priestley uses his characters to create drama and significance in this scene. And I've ticked that because she's come back and at least tried to tie it back to her opening statement that it was about the characters. So hopefully you could see where this writer would need to go to get the top marks. And this is typical of many essays that I read. They don't really think about the author's purpose, what they're actually trying to achieve in terms of the effect on the audience. So check your own writing and see how you do.